Okay, welcome back everyone to the final part of this Sportscast series. I hope you have enjoyed thus far. Okay, Will, let's talk about a couple sleeper teams this year that could make a run at the playoffs this year. This time I'm going to let you go first.
All right, perfect. Well, I guess the teams that I've kind of identified, I'm not sure how realistic it's going to be that they're going to make a push for the playoffs, but I feel like we're going to have people saying, you know what? They're a mid-major. They should be in the talks if they go undefeated. And the first team on my list, we've talked about their quarterback. We've talked about them in Conference USA. It's the Marshall Thundering Herd. Behind Rakeem Cato, I think that they've got a really good chance at an undefeated season. They're playing in a weak Conference USA that has a couple of teams that could give them problems. I don't think it's unlikely that they go undefeated. I'm not saying I think they do. I think they're going to lose one game. But I think there's going to be people saying, if they go undefeated, do they deserve a spot there? My second team is BYU down in Provo, Utah. I think it's a really good team down there that's really got a great coach in Bronco Mendenhall, someone who really has the trust of his players, and an up-and-rising junior quarterback in Taysom Hill, someone who completely ran over Texas last year. I actually think that this year, too, playing Texas again, they've got a decent shot to actually go in and beat Texas, shock the world for a second time. However, I don't think BYU is going to go undefeated this year. I think they're going to lose a game, probably to Houston. That's the game on the radar that I'm like, I'm not sure they can win that one, just because Houston's going to be mad that BYU's beat them in the past, and Houston's not a team to let that go lightly. For the third team I'm looking at, we're staying in the state of Utah, but we're going up more north to Logan, Utah, where the Utah State Aggies. They've got another great quarterback up there, Chucky Keaton. They've had great coaches there in the past, and their new coach is a fabulous coach as well. And I really think that they can make some serious noise in the Mountain West and actually win the Mountain West Conference this season. I think they're probably going to lose 3 games. They have to play BYU. They're going to lose to BYU. They've got a tough opponent in Arkansas State out of the Sun Belt Conference that I really feel is going to give Utah State some issues. And then my guess is that they're going to lose another one there in the Mountain West Conference, potentially to Wyoming. They've got the coach coming in from North Dakota State. He's got them upset-minded. And I think Wyoming is a good second team in the Mountain West Conference. Utah State wins that conference, but Wyoming's also a team in there. Wyoming's not my fourth team, though. That team goes to Kansas State. We've talked a little bit about Kansas State already. They've got some great players that Craig has mentioned at quarterback and wide receiver. And the fact that they're playing in a conference where there's 3 really powerful teams in Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Baylor gives Kansas State a chance to make some noise and actually make it to a decent bowl game this year. And the last team, I've already mentioned them. Craig and I disagree on this, I know. I'm looking at the Arkansas Razorbacks. I think that they've got a solid team. They've really been on the down low ever since they lost to Louisiana Monroe in overtime a couple years ago. And everyone's just kind of discounting them that they're not going to be able to do much. We're not going to see much out of Arkansas this year. I think that they surprise everybody this year. They're not going to go to the national championship. They're not going to win the SEC. They're not even going to come in first or second in their division. But they're a team that no one's talking about that we should actually be looking at like they might upset a couple of people. And I really think they've got a few upsets in there. They're probably going to lose to people like Auburn, Mississippi State, Missouri. I mentioned earlier I think they're going to lose to Texas A&M. But those are teams that I think could really make a splash this year and make us scratch our heads and say, I wonder.
Well, definitely Will and I have very similar teams. 3 of my top 4 teams are very similar to that. Number 1, obviously right away, I'm going to say is BYU. Love their schedule, and if/win, because I have them beating Texas. I think they go into Austin, and I think this game it's more about BYU playing for respect. That's what this game is about for BYU. This isn't about BYU trying to make it into the playoffs. I think this season is a season about respect. And I think that's something BYU is going to absolutely play for. And they're going to want this game just a little bit more because I think Texas is going to be like, you're now coming into our turf and we're going to beat you. And I think BYU says, nah, not so fast. We're going to continue your misery. Number 2, again, the Marshall Thundering Herd. Will and I have talked about this team. I want to talk about their schedule. Will mentioned it just momentarily, but here's their 2 hardest non-conference games. Miami, Ohio on the road and at home against Ohio. Ohio is a respectable program, but they're far from a quality win. Here's their conference slate. At Old Dominion, home against Middle Tennessee. At FIU, home against FAU. At Southern Miss, home against Rice. At UAB, and home against Western Kentucky. Rice looks like their hardest conference game, but it's at home. Then they have the Conference USA title game that right now a few experts are picking the upstart UTSA team. That's the same team that we talked about, the Texas San Antonio, who has over 38 seniors on their roster. Most likely they will be in a bowl game. They actually went 7-5 last year. There just wasn't enough room for them to actually make a bowl game. So this year they could find their way into the conference title game. But I think, for me, I still like Rice to win that division. Marshall, for me right now, they're this year's Northern Illinois. There's not a team on that schedule Marshall cannot beat by more than 20 points. Maybe even not more by 30 points. Number 3, this is a team that I am super high on, and I know I've talked about in the past. And now I'm going to really break it down for you. The Ole Miss Runnin' Rebels. What's not to like about this team? If you want to talk about the hottest team, at least on paper, in the SEC, then you don't need to look any further than the Rebels. They have one of the best defensive linemen in Robert Nishke, who we just talked about. They have a really good quarterback in Wallace. And they have probably one of the best young wide receivers in Treadwell. Plus, they get Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi State, and Auburn at home this year. You win 2 of those 3 games and you're pretty much in the SEC title game. It's a no-brainer. They will have to beat a young but underrated LSU team on the road, and, well, winning in Death Valley and LSU and a game that's most likely going to be at night is pretty much impossible unless you're Alabama. And then they have to go on the road to Texas A&M, but other than that, the schedule isn't as scary as many like to make it out to be. Games between Alabama and Texas A&M back-to-back will pretty much tell us everything we need to know about this team early on in the year. Number 4 is the Houston Cougars. Will and I have spent a lot of time on this team, and they have a very good chance in being this year's UCF. I really feel that they can be. The problem is, Will, on the other hand, will think that they can go into Provo and beat BYU. I, on the other hand, I don't see that happening. Provo is a lot harder to play in, and in Houston, I don't think they can handle those elements. But one thing we do forget is that Houston was 5-0 last year. Houston did start the year off 5-0, and then they lost to BYU in a pretty wild shootout. But this is a team that returned 16 starters, 6 on offense, which includes their quarterback, and 10 on defense. Their schedule is pretty tough with trips to BYU. Provo, like I just said, it's not very fun for teams who aren't used to playing up there. They also host UCF, who could still win the division, but I feel will take a step back this year. They also have to travel to SMU and Cincinnati to close out the year, and those 2 teams play pretty good football at home. If they get BYU and UCF, there really isn't another team on that schedule that could really stop them this season. There are some people that are picking Cincinnati to win this division. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. Cincinnati has built a very respectable program out there. Yeah, I would not be one bit surprised to see them there. And so my last team that is on my list, and I know I've talked about this team quite a bit, most definitely the UCLA Bruins. If you look at the schedule, the possibilities are there for this team to potentially go undefeated, but it won't be easy for this team. In week 1, they do have to travel to Virginia. Not a great team, but again, traveling from West Coast to East Coast can always play tricks on those teams that have to travel west to the East. In week 3, they have to travel to Jerry World to play the Longhorns. After that, they travel to Arizona. However, this is a team that does get Oregon, Arizona, USC, and Stanford at home in the Rose Bowl. I'm not sure if they'll be able to beat Oregon, let alone Stanford, but the possibility is there. Plus, with the players like Hundley, Miles Jack, most likely will have maybe a down year, but the talent is still there. All coming back, this is a team that has the look to be a serious playoff threat this season. Okay, Will, now that we've broken down our 5 teams that could potentially make it to the playoffs, let's talk about the one thing that we love to talk about when it comes to college sports, and those are upsets. So here are my top 5 upsets that will happen this year. Number 5, like I said, I like Ole Miss to beat Auburn. I don't think Ole Miss can beat Alabama, but again, I think in the rematch against another team from Alabama, I think they take down Auburn in the biggest win of the season. Number 4, like I said earlier, I like Kansas State to beat Oklahoma State to at least give them a share of the 3rd place spot in the Big 12 this season. Number 3, I like Michigan State over Ohio State. I realize that probably won't be much of an upset to a lot of you, and maybe it shouldn't really be number 3 on my list, but I think in one of the biggest games of the year and more importantly, one of the biggest games in the Big Ten this year, I think this is going to be a huge upset that's really going to change the landscape of college football in the Big Ten Conference. Number 2, I had a hard time deciding this one, but I'm going to go Arizona State over Notre Dame. I talked about this earlier. I think Notre Dame is going to be going into this game with an opportunity and the possibility to maybe squeak their way into the playoffs. And they're going to have to travel all the way out to the desert and have to play a good Arizona State team. And this is an Arizona State squad that, again, they're trying to climb up there. But again, they're probably going to be middle of the pack at least. So this could be one of their more marquee wins that we get. We saw it last year with Wisconsin. Although it was a pretty controversial finish, nonetheless, Arizona State used that win to springboard themselves, and I think the same thing happens. And number 1, not going to be a shocker at all. I've just said it. My number 1 upset of the year will be BYU knocking off Texas in Austin in week 2. Like I said, this isn't a game about BYU getting to the playoffs. This isn't a game about, or even a season for that matter. This isn't a season about BYU making the playoffs or even making like the Fiesta Bowl or maybe the Orange Bowl or maybe another higher up bowl game. This is about BYU attaining the respect that they feel that they deserve. I talked about this in my very first podcast. BYU, if you want respect, you have to win. This is your season. This is your opportunity. I was watching some of the media day earlier today for BYU. And that was the thing they talked about. And that's the whole feeling that you get from this team. If they want that respect, they have to get it. And I think they do. They go on the road, they beat Texas, and they really springboard themselves for a pretty amazing season. And I think they do go undefeated. I think the one game that they may slip up on, maybe at the end of the year when they have to travel to Cal. Because as I talked to Will about this, that game has a feeling to me of a 5-6 Cal team trying to make a bowl game, and in comes BYU, a program that, again, is trying to go undefeated, maybe make the playoffs. If not, most likely would get an invite to probably play in the Fiesta Bowl. That's my upsets. Those are my top 5 upsets. Will, what are your top 5 upsets?
I feel like mine are a lot more out there than yours, although I can agree with every single upset that you just said. I get the feeling you're probably not going to agree with most of mine. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, but I've got a lot of Giants going down because we've had the past 2 seasons, we've had Giants go down early. Louisiana Monroe overtakes Arkansas. Last year we had North Dakota State toppling Kansas State. We've seen stuff like that. Appalachian State over Michigan. I'm not choosing any Division II opponents to knock off Division I opponents. I'm not that crazy. There's a couple that are pretty close. So starting with number 5, I mentioned that I think that Marshall is going to run the table and maybe lose a game really late in the season. What I've got them doing is I've got them going 11-0 and going into the day after Thanksgiving game hosting Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky's a really tough team that I think, given the right moment, could end all speculation about is Marshall deserving to be in the playoffs. People are going to be asking that. Western Kentucky quiets everybody. They take care of Marshall, and we get a huge upset on that last weekend with a team that most people didn't even think would be playing for anything at that point in the season. The second upset I have is actually an upset that you had on your list, Craig, and that's Arizona over Notre Dame. This is my number 4 big upset for the year. Arizona State is a team that is a very gritty team, and it's really hard to beat them down in Tempe. We saw that last year with Wisconsin, even though there was a controversial finish. And we've seen many Pac-12 games over the years. We've just seen Arizona State is tough to beat in Arizona. Add on top of that, the weeks before that, they've got at Washington, which should be easy, and then Utah right before that. That's 2 easy games that they're going to be able to prepare for, and I think that they beat Notre Dame. I don't think Arizona State's going to be one of the best teams next year, but I feel that they'll be able to knock off a star opponent like Notre Dame. Number 3 on my list, and this is a part 1 and a part 2. I mentioned in the last podcast that I think that UCLA is going to have a couple of slip-ups early in the year. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And I've got them losing their first 2 games of the season. I know this sounds crazy, but they have to start, UCLA starts by going across the country and playing a morning game against Virginia. It's a tough matchup. Opening weekend, and anytime a West Coast team has to travel to the East Coast and play a morning game, they struggle. I think Virginia's going to be a better team this year, and I think Virginia knocks off UCLA in that opener. Adding poison onto this, and UCLA fans, go ahead and get mad at me. Remember, I picked you to win the Pac-12. You're going to go home the week after that, and Memphis is going to beat you. And it's going to be eye-opening. There's going to be rumors about, is this team extremely overrated? Do we need a new head coach? Maybe Hundley isn't our guy. You start 0-2. But don't worry, you go to Texas the next week, and you take care of business. And then you can just go down your schedule. Texas, Arizona State, Utah, Oregon. You beat Oregon, Cal, Colorado, Arizona, Washington, USC, Stanford. I've got you winning out the rest of the season. But I think that you're going to lose those first 2 games. I see the Virginia game as a trap game, and the Memphis game as a team that's a lot better than most people are saying. They're in the American Athletic Conference. They could make some noise. And if UCLA is licking his wounds and saying, okay, well, you know what? We didn't play well last week, but we're going to come in this week. We got them. Don't worry. I think you could get shocked 2 weeks in a row. So that's number 3. That was a 2-parter. Number 4. Last year we saw Missouri come out of nowhere, come from the bottom of the SEC into the top. And one thing that concerns me about that is they lost one of their star players in Dorial Beckham-Green. They lost a lot of their defense. They lost Michael Sam, who was a stud on their team last year. And I just feel like they're gonna have a game that they blow next year. And the team I've chosen, it's not going to be South Dakota State the first week. It's just not going to be South Dakota State. But that second week, they have to go to Toledo. It's not an easy place to play. It's going to be on ABC. It's already been scheduled on ABC. I think Toledo can knock off Missouri that second week and send Missouri fans scrambling, saying, are we going back to where we were? Are we not a class of the SEC again? I think Missouri will still be a good team. They'll hold their own weight. But I've got them losing to Toledo in week 2. And here's the big one, and I know I'm going to get screamed at for this, and Craig's probably going to be shocked that I'm saying this because I was touting this Michigan State team just a couple days ago. But I'm looking at the schedule, and it scares me. They've got their opener against Jacksonville State. And Jacksonville State is, well, they're going to beat Jacksonville State. They're not going to lose to Jacksonville State. But then they have to go out to Autzen. They got to play Oregon, and they're going to lose that game. No one wins at Autzen. It's really hard. The only team to do it in previous years for a very long time is Stanford. And it was close, it was gritty, and Oregon really didn't play their best. And they were all night games. This game against Michigan State, it's an afternoon game. It's when the Autzen faithful are out. It's hot. The Ducks are used to that. They move fast. The Ducks are going to be able to beat Michigan State. That's not my upset, though. My prediction is that after Michigan State loses to Oregon, they drop 2 consecutive games after losing to Oregon. First going home and being shocked by Eastern Michigan in a game that's it's just going to resonate that, wow, what's happening to Michigan State? Are they really this bad? And then the next week it doesn't get easier. They got a Wyoming team coming in the week after that I really like, that I think can send them for a 3rd straight loss. So that's my biggest one of this upcoming season. After Michigan State loses to Oregon, they drop 3 consecutive games, including the Oregon game, to Oregon, Eastern Michigan, and lastly Wyoming, before they rebound and actually beat Nebraska.
I am speechless. I will agree with you on one little thing is that I think Wyoming is going to be a lot tougher team than people are going to give them credit for. I think people underestimate how good of a coach Greg Boyle is and what a dynasty he built at North Dakota State. North Dakota State, if Boyle had been able to stay, I wouldn't have been surprised if a conference like the MAC hadn't come along and said, would you guys be interested in moving up to FBS? I could have easily seen that happen. So I think Craig Boyle, when he moved to Wyoming, I remember I told this to Will, I thought Boise State made a huge mistake. Boise State made a huge mistake in letting Craig Boyle go. I think Craig Boyle could have easily came in and he could have been a very much an equal to Dan Hawkins, to what he built at Boise State. Because remember, Chris Peterson inherited Boise State. Dan Hawkins built Boise State. Craig Boyle would have done the exact same thing. And I think in time, Boise State, people would have been talking, Boise State is back. I think Boise State's going to look back on this. They got their guy. I know that they're excited. They got back one of their own. They got a guy back from Arkansas State. They're excited, and I'm happy for that. But Wyoming made out like a bandit. People are going to be looking back on this decision and are really going to be surprised at how good of a coach Greg Boyle really is. But I will disagree. I don't think that they lose to Michigan or Eastern Michigan. I don't see that happening. But Wyoming, that could be a tough game. That could be an upset alert, especially if they come back home and they play sloppy against Eastern Michigan, which could happen. They come back and they go out to Oregon, Michigan State. They're feeling good about themselves. They're saying this is a huge game, and it is. Because you think about it, the Big Ten's reputation has just been rocked for the past few years. And the Big Ten has been trying so hard to say we are still relevant in college football, but the way they have performed in big games in the past have said otherwise. So that's what's going to happen is Michigan State's going to go and work. Michigan State, they're carrying the banner for the Big Ten going into Autzen Stadium. They lose that game. They come home and they're like, okay, we do have Eastern Michigan, kind of like what you said with UCLA. UCLA, maybe they do lose that opening game, and I wouldn't be surprised by that at all, losing on the road to Virginia. Then coming home and saying, okay, at least we got Memphis, and they play sloppy against Memphis. I think the same thing could happen with Michigan State. Michigan State comes home, well, we didn't play well, but we get Eastern Michigan. Okay, fine. Then Eastern Michigan just comes in and they play like we don't have anything to lose. We're Eastern Michigan. We haven't been to a bowl game in 4 or 5 decades. I mean, Eastern Michigan hasn't been relevant at all. Here they come into East Lansing and they almost pull off the impossible. Then in comes Wyoming. Well, I think what we need to now do is we need to now move on here to our final topic of this podcast, of this series that we have discussed thus far. And I think it's probably the most that all of you have been waiting for. If you guys have listened to nothing else, then I think this is the most important thing that you do need to listen to. What are our predictions for this upcoming playoff? The very first one. I know Will and I both agree that we weren't exactly excited that a playoff was created. I think it's a mistake, but nonetheless, it's here. I'm still excited for it because it's college football, and what's not to get excited about when you talk about college football. So instead of me giving my list, Will, I'm going to let you go again first. Will, tell us who is in the Final Four in college football and who wins the national championship.
Well, if you've been listening all the way through, you already know who my Final Four teams in this playoff, who they're going to be. And I've got Florida State, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Baylor coming in 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it'd mean that the committee would send number 1 Florida State down to Pasadena to play against Baylor. And what I've got happening in that game is people are going to be expecting a shootout. It's Jameis Winston versus Bryce Petty, 2 quarterbacks who I feel are going to be battling out for the Heisman this coming year. It's going to be a game people are going to be talking about. People are going to be expecting scores in the 40s and the 50s. And I think it's going to surprise a lot of people. It's going to be defense that wins the game. Florida State defeats Baylor 28-21 to advance to their second consecutive national championship game. Then we've got Oklahoma and Alabama playing in a rematch yet again in the Sugar Bowl down in Louisiana. Just a matchup that everyone is going to be dying to see. Alabama's going to be out for blood, but the difference maker is going to be Trevor Knight, quarterback for the Sooners. I feel like he goes in there and he shows Alabama that last year was not a fluke. Oklahoma can do it to them year in and year out. Their reign is over. I've got Oklahoma embarrassing Alabama 52-27 to earn the right to attempt to dethrone Florida State in the national championship game 10 days later. Then that sets up Florida State versus Oklahoma in the national championship game. It's a game I would be extremely excited to see. I think it will be a defensive battle. Once again, Florida State's defense wins it for them. They don't even let Oklahoma get in the end zone, and Florida State wins a simple game, 14-6, for back-to-back championships after Winston wins back-to-back Heismans.
I don't think I can't really fault that prediction at all. Here is how I see this year's Final Four playing out. And again, if you have been listening to all three of them, you probably will remember from my second one, I've pretty much told you the 4 teams that I think will play. I believe out in the Rose Bowl, I think Ohio State sneaks their way in, even though they won't win their conference. I think Ohio State will get in just because they will have only one loss, and that loss will be to Michigan State, and Michigan State loses to Nebraska in the Big Ten championship game. So I got Alabama playing Ohio State in Pasadena. Then in the Sugar Bowl, I have the Oregon Ducks traveling down to play Florida State in New Orleans. I think this would be I think both of these games would be very highly anticipated, but I got Alabama routing Ohio State. I think Alabama would just be way too strong, and I don't think, even though that Ohio State should have the talent to at least make the game interesting, I think Alabama as a team will be a team on a mission. There will be a team going, we had to travel all the way out to the West Coast to play Ohio State. We are not here to mess around. I mean, if you remember back when they won the national championship game against Notre Dame, I think it's going to be that exact type of game. Alabama's going to come out early and set the tone, and Ohio State is not going to know what hit them in the mouth. And then in the Sugar Bowl, Oregon and Florida State. This is a game for Oregon that they're going to view as a game for respect, because the last time they were in a similar game like this, in my opinion, they outplayed Auburn. They did everything they could. Auburn, it was their day. Michael Dyer, he was just not going to be denied. I'm sorry. I know that that's a touchy subject for a lot of you Duck fans, but it's still an incredible run, and you still have to give him that. Nonetheless, I am still going to take Florida State in that game. I think Florida State, they just have way too much talent. I just think that this is a team, again, they're just going to be that much more inspired to get back to the national championship game. So that sets up my championship game in Dallas and Jerry World with Alabama taking on Florida State. Florida State will get another shot at a team from the state of Alabama, and they will beat another team from the state of Alabama, and it will be the Crimson Tide, and it's going to be an amazing game. I think this is a game that it will be a defensive battle, but there's still going to be some points scored in this one. I'm going to take Florida State winning this game 38-35. I love these sort of weird final score games like that, but I just think there's going to be some points scored in this game. But I think at the end of the day, I think Alabama will make a few more mistakes than what Florida State will. So that's what I have. I think Florida State beats Alabama, and I believe it starts a new streak where the SEC loses in the title game for the next couple of seasons. Well, that is certainly all the time that we have for today. We thank you again for listening to this college football mini-series, if you will. I would also like to thank everyone that supported me and gave me feedback while I made this project. This project, if you will, and will probably be the last one I will do for a while. I'll make sure to do another one before the semester ends, but I do have other things that I will have to work on. And I know, Will, you have something, and I'll let you say something here really quick. So I also thank you, Will, for your help. It has been a lot of fun having you in here for my last 3. Do you have anything else you want to add? I can tell that you do.
I just want to thank you, Craig, for the opportunity. I've done podcasts in the past, and I've really enjoyed them. And just wanted to thank you for this opportunity. I will actually be starting a podcast this summer focusing on different sports topics. Craig will definitely be a guest on it multiple times. I'll have a co-host that I've already spoken with that will be joining me because he's here in this town. Craig's leaving, otherwise I would ask him. But I'm sure that we're going to have Craig phoning in for a couple of them from wherever he'll be moving to. And just want to thank you, Craig, for this opportunity. It's been great. And just remember that I am a quarter Nebraskan. I found that out recently. And a quarter of me does love the Huskers. So that will be the 4th quarter that I'll be rooting for them.
Which is probably the most important quarter that you can ever root for a football team. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do still want to hear from you guys. I'm going to put up on my website. I want to know what you think about this podcast. I want to know who you think is on, what your upset alert of the year is. What do you think your biggest upset is? I want to know who your Heisman Trophy favorites are. And I want to know what you think about college football, because I know even though it's still late June, we haven't even hit July yet. We haven't even hit most of the media days yet. But come on, you know you love to talk about college football. I love to talk about college football. We all do. So that's why we did this mini series for you guys. Well, I thank everyone again. And as we always like to end on these shows, reporting from Rexburg, Idaho, I'm Craig Handy.
And I'm William Cook.
Saying good night and hey, go watch a ball game.